At the family dinner, my daughter-in-law leaned close to my ear and whispered, "I'm pregnant with your son's baby, but he doesn't know yet." I simply nodded and passed the bowl of mashed potatoes across the table. If you're here with me today, follow my story until the end, and tell me the city you're watching from. I always wonder how far these stories travel. Because what happened that night at my son's dinner table changed the way I saw my entire family. And it all started with that quiet whisper. Sunday dinners used to mean something in our family. For over 30 years, they were sacred. Back when my husband Robert was still alive, he insisted on it. No matter how busy life gets, he would say, family sits down together once a week. Even after he passed away 3 years ago, I tried to keep the tradition alive. Sometimes at my house. Sometimes at Daniel's. Daniel is my only son. He's 38 now, tall like his father, with the same quiet smile that used to make people trust him instantly. And then there's Emily. My daughter-in-law. She married Daniel 6 years ago, in a beautiful ceremony that I helped pay for. I still remember the sunlight that day, the way it filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Mark's Church. Emily looked radiant in her white dress. I remember thinking how lucky Daniel was. And how lucky I was to gain a daughter. At least, that's what I believed back then. That Sunday evening, Daniel had invited everyone over to their house in the suburbs. A neat little place with white siding and a small maple tree in the front yard. I arrived a little early, as I usually do. Old habits. When you've spent 40 years hosting family dinners, you never quite shake the instinct to help in the kitchen. Emily was already cooking when I walked in. The smell of roasted chicken filled the house. "Hi, Margaret," she said without turning around. She always calls me Margaret. Not Mom. Not even Mrs. Whitaker. Just Margaret. I used to think it was a modern thing. Now I'm not so sure. The dining room table was already set. 6 plates. Wine glasses. Cloth napkins folded into neat triangles. Emily likes everything to look perfect. Daniel came in from the backyard carrying a tray of grilled vegetables. "Mom," he said, smiling when he saw me. "You're early." "I brought the apple pie," I told him. His eyes lit up immediately. That's one thing that hasn't changed since he was 10 years old. Daniel has never been able to resist my apple pie. "Best pie in 3 counties, he always says. Emily glanced at the pie briefly as she walked past. "Looks nice," she said. Just that. Looks nice. We sat down around 6. Daniel at the head of the table. Emily beside him. Their daughter Lily across from me. Lily is 16 now. Tall, quiet, observant. A lot like I was at that age. Dinner started normally enough. Daniel poured wine. Emily carved the chicken. Lily scrolled through something on her phone until her mother gave her a sharp look. "Phone's away at the table," Emily said. Lily sighed but obeyed. The clink of silverware filled the room. For a while, it felt almost peaceful. Daniel talked about a project at work. Emily mentioned a friend's upcoming baby shower. Lily complained about a math test. Ordinary things. Family things. The kind of conversation that makes you believe everything is fine. Halfway through dinner, I reached for the salt. That's when Emily leaned closer to me. At first, I thought she was going to ask me to pass something. But instead, she tilted her head slightly and whispered so quietly that no one else could hear. "I'm pregnant with your son's baby," she paused. Then she added something that made my fingers go cold around the salt shaker. "But he doesn't know yet." For a moment, the room seemed to go silent. Not actually silent. I could still hear Daniel talking about work. Still hear Lily tapping her fork against her plate. But inside my head, everything went very still. I slowly placed the salt shaker back on the table. Then I looked at Emily. She was smiling politely at Daniel, as if she had just asked me to pass the bread. Our eyes met for only a second. But in that second, I saw something in her expression. Something calculating. Something almost curious. Like she was waiting to see how I would react. I didn't react. I just nodded. Then I reached for the bowl of mashed potatoes and passed it to Daniel. "Here you go, sweetheart," I said calmly. Emily sat back in her chair, still smiling, still watching me. And that's when I realized something important. That whisper wasn't a confession. It was a test. And somehow, I had just become part of a game I didn't even know we were playing. The rest of dinner continued as if nothing had happened. Daniel laughed at one of Lily's jokes. Emily refilled everyone's wine glasses. I asked Daniel about his work schedule for the week. But all the while, I could feel Emily's eyes drifting toward me. Measuring. Studying. Waiting. And for the first time in 6 years, I began to wonder what kind of woman my son had really married. Because that whisper at the dinner table wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the moment I realized something had been wrong in this family for a very long time. And I was only just starting to see it. If you think that whisper was shocking, wait until you hear what happened next. Because the truth about that pregnancy was far worse than I ever imagined. The strange thing about shocking moments is this. They don't always explode. Sometimes they sit quietly in the middle of the room, pretending to be ordinary. That night, the whisper Emily gave me stayed between us like a secret folded inside a napkin. Dinner went on. Daniel finished telling his story about a difficult client. Lily rolled her eyes when her father mentioned how teenagers these days live inside their phones. Emily laughed softly at the right moments, pouring wine and asking polite questions. If someone had walked into that dining room, they would have seen a perfectly normal family dinner. But inside my head, I kept replaying those 7 words. "I'm pregnant with your son's baby, but he doesn't know yet." There are some sentences that change the air in a room. That was one of them. I watched Daniel across the table. He looked happy. Relaxed. The way people look when they believe their life is moving forward exactly the way it should. He had always wanted another child. Emily knew that. Everyone in the family knew that. For the past 2 years, Daniel had mentioned it every so often, never pushing, never demanding. Just hopeful. "Maybe Lily could use a little brother someday," he said once at Christmas. Emily had smiled then. But it wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile people give when they're humoring someone. At the time, I thought I might be imagining it. Now I wasn't so sure. Emily stood up to clear the plates. "I'll get dessert," she said brightly. Daniel immediately turned toward me. "Mom, is that the apple pie you brought?" I nodded. His grin was exactly the same one he had when he was a boy sneaking extra cookies from the kitchen. "Best day of the week just got better," he said. Lily groaned. "Dad, you say that every time Grandma brings pie." "That's because your grandma makes the best pie in the state," Daniel replied. He said it so easily. So naturally. And for a moment, I felt something tighten in my chest. Because the man sitting there laughing with his daughter had no idea what had just happened 2 feet away from him. Emily returned with 4 plates. She placed one carefully in front of Daniel. Another in front of Lily. Then she set mine down last. Her fingers brushed the table for just a moment longer than necessary. A tiny pause. A silent reminder. Our eyes met again. This time she smiled. Not warmly. Not kindly. Just knowingly. Then she sat down and picked up her fork. "Margaret makes the best pie," she said casually. Daniel laughed. "See? Even Emily agrees." I nodded politely. But inside, something was shifting. Because the more I thought about that whisper, the less sense it made. Why tell me? Why not tell her husband first? Why lean across the table and say it quietly, like a secret meant only for me? Unless. The thought came slowly, like a puzzle piece sliding into place. Unless the baby wasn't the point. Lily excused herself first. Homework, she muttered, already halfway down the hallway before anyone responded. Daniel stretched in his chair. I should check the grill outside before it cools down too much. He stood up and headed toward the back door. That left just Emily and me at the table. The kitchen suddenly felt quieter. The clatter of dishes in the sink. The hum of the refrigerator. Emily folded her napkin carefully and placed it beside her plate. Then she looked at me. So, she said lightly. What do you think? Her tone was almost playful. Like she had just told me about a new haircut. I took a sip of water before answering. I think that's something you should tell your husband. Emily tilted her head slightly. Oh, I will. She smiled again. But not yet. There was something unsettling about the way she said it. Not nervous. Not emotional. Calculated. Like someone discussing the timing of a business deal. I studied her face carefully. 6 years ago, when Daniel first introduced her to me, I thought she was confident. Strong. Modern. The kind of woman who knew exactly what she wanted. Now I realized something else. Emily didn't just know what she wanted. She knew how to wait for it. Daniel came back inside a minute later. All good out there, he said, sitting down again. Emily immediately turned toward him. Did you check the propane tank? Yep. Plenty left. Good, she said. And just like that, the moment between us disappeared. The conversation moved on. Daniel talked about a weekend trip he wanted to plan. Lily shouted from the hallway asking where her math book was. Emily laughed at something on her phone. The evening slowly drifted toward its normal ending. But I couldn't stop thinking about one thing. Emily hadn't looked surprised when I stayed calm. She hadn't looked relieved. She had looked interested. Like someone watching a chessboard. And that's when I realized something else. That whisper wasn't meant to share news. It was meant to watch my reaction. Because whatever Emily was planning, she wanted to know exactly which side of the board I was standing on. And I had a feeling the real game hadn't even started yet. When you reach my age, you learn something about silence. Silence is never empty. It always means something. That night, after the dishes were cleared and Daniel walked me to my car, the silence between Emily and me stayed with me the whole drive home. I kept replaying the moment in my mind. The whisper. The pause. The way she watched me afterward. And most of all, the way she said, asterisk, but he doesn't know yet. Asterisk people don't usually hide good news. Not from their husbands. Not from the father of their child. So why was she hiding this one? My house felt unusually quiet when I got home. It always does. 3 years after Robert passed away, I still sometimes expect to hear the television in the living room when I walk through the door. Or the sound of his chair creaking as he shifts his weight. Old habits of memory. But that night, the quiet felt different. Heavier. I hung my coat by the door and set the empty pie dish on the kitchen counter. The clock above the stove read 9:18 p.m. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat at the small table by the window. Robert used to call that spot my thinking chair. Whenever something bothered me, that's where I ended up. And that's exactly where I sat that night. Thinking. At first, I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. Pregnancy announcements can be complicated. Maybe Emily wanted to wait until the right moment. Maybe she was planning a surprise. Maybe she told me first because she thought I'd understand. But the more I thought about it, the more those explanations didn't quite fit. Because Emily hadn't looked excited. She hadn't looked emotional. She hadn't looked like someone sharing joyful news. She had looked curious. Like someone observing an experiment. And the more I thought about that expression, the more another thought started creeping into my mind. Maybe that whisper wasn't about the baby at all. Maybe it was about something else entirely. I went upstairs around 10. But I didn't sleep much that night. When you reach 70, sleep becomes a fragile thing anyway. And once your mind starts turning over questions, it's hard to make it stop. Around 2 in the morning, I got up and walked into the hallway. There's a shelf there with family photos. Daniel at age 6, missing his 2 front teeth. Daniel in his high school football uniform. Daniel on his wedding day. That last photo made me pause. Emily stood beside him in her white dress, smiling for the camera. Her arm looped through Daniel's. Her head tilted slightly toward him. At the time, I remember thinking how confident she looked. Now, looking at that same photo, something else stood out. Her eyes. They weren't looking at Daniel. They were looking at the camera. Directly. As if she already knew exactly how everything would turn out. The next morning, I tried to go about my day normally. I watered the plants. I walked to the mailbox. I even drove to the grocery store for a few things I didn't really need. But my mind kept circling back to the same questions. Why tell me? Why not tell Daniel? Why say it that way? Asterisk, he doesn't know yet. Asterisk, that word yet stayed with me. Because it suggested something very specific. A plan. Not a secret. A plan. The first small crack in the story appeared 2 days later. I was at the pharmacy picking up my blood pressure medication when my phone rang. It was Lily. "Grandma," she said quietly. Her voice sounded different. Careful. "Hi, sweetheart," I said. "Everything okay?" There was a pause. Then she said something that made my stomach tighten. "Can I ask you something, and you won't tell Mom?" Teenagers usually ask that question when they want permission for something. But Lily's tone wasn't nervous. It was serious. "Of course," I said gently. Another pause. Then Lily lowered her voice. "Did Mom tell you something at dinner the other night?" For a moment, I didn't answer. The fact that Lily was asking that question meant one thing. She had noticed something too. "Yes," I said carefully. "She told me something." "What did she say?" I thought about the best way to respond. "When the time is right," I told her, "your mother should explain it herself." Lily didn't sound surprised. She just sighed softly. "I knew it," she murmured. My grip tightened slightly around the phone. "Knew what?" Another pause. And then Lily said something that made the entire situation feel suddenly much larger. "Mom's been acting weird for months," she said. "Like, really weird." I leaned back in my chair. "What do you mean?" Lily hesitated. Then she spoke very quietly. "I've seen her meeting someone." For a moment, the kitchen around me seemed to go completely still. "Meeting someone?" I asked. "Yes." "Who?" "I don't know," Lily said. "But it's definitely not Dad." The silence on the phone stretched for several seconds. And in that silence, something cold settled in my chest. Because suddenly that whisper at the dinner table made a lot more sense. Emily hadn't been sharing good news. She had been testing something. Testing me. And now, for the first time, I began to suspect something that hadn't even crossed my mind before. What if the real secret wasn't the pregnancy? What if the real secret was whose child it actually was? After my conversation with Lily, the house felt even quieter than usual. I placed my phone on the kitchen table and sat there for a long time, staring at nothing in particular. Sometimes the most unsettling moments aren't loud. They're quiet. Quiet enough for the truth to slowly rise to the surface. Lily's words kept echoing in my mind. Asterisk, Mom's been meeting someone. Asterisk, it's definitely not Dad. Asterisk, teenagers don't usually notice much about the adults around them. They're too busy with school, friends, and whatever is happening on their phones. So if Lily had noticed something strange, that meant whatever was going on had been happening for a while. And that thought led me to another realization. Maybe the whisper at dinner wasn't the beginning of the story. Maybe it was the moment Emily decided I was ready to know my role in it. For the rest of that afternoon, I tried to keep myself busy. I folded laundry. I watered the plants again even though they didn't need it. I even reorganized the pantry, something Robert used to tease me about. Margaret, he would say with a smile, no one needs the flour and sugar alphabetized. But organizing things always helped me think. And that afternoon, as I moved cans and jars from one shelf to another, memories started lining up in my mind. Little things. Small moments I hadn't paid much attention to before. The first one came from last spring. Daniel and Emily had invited me over for a barbecue. I remember Emily checking her phone constantly that afternoon. Every few minutes. She would glance down, read something quickly, then lock the screen again. At the time, I assumed it was work. Emily works in marketing, and she's always said her clients expect quick responses. But now I remembered something else. Each time she checked her phone, she stepped away from the group first. Just a few steps. But enough to be out of earshot. Another memory followed. This one from a few months later. Daniel had called me late one evening. Mom, he said casually, have you heard from Emily tonight? I told him no. He laughed softly. She said she was meeting a friend for coffee after work, but she's not answering her phone. At the time, I told him not to worry. Traffic. Dead battery. Any number of small explanations. But now that moment felt different. Because I remembered Daniel saying something else. Before we hung up. She's been doing that a lot lately, he said. Meeting friends after work. I didn't think much of it then. Now I wondered how many of those friends Daniel had actually met. By early evening, I found myself standing in front of the hallway photo shelf again. It seems I've been doing that a lot lately. Looking back. Trying to understand things that didn't make sense before. I picked up the framed photo from Daniel and Emily's wedding. It's a beautiful picture. The church behind them. Sunlight pouring through the tall windows. Emily's dress flowing perfectly around her. Daniel's hand resting gently at the small of her back. For a moment, I studied their faces. Daniel looked proud. Happy. Certain. But Emily looked composed. Controlled. As if she already understood something Daniel didn't. I set the photo back down slowly. Because suddenly another thought occurred to me. Emily had whispered that sentence to me very carefully. Not loudly. Not emotionally. Just quietly enough that only I could hear. And then she watched me. Not Daniel. Not Lily. Me. Which meant she wasn't worried about her husband's reaction. She was worried about mine. That evening, Daniel called. Hey Mom, he said. His voice sounded relaxed. Comfortable. How's your day going? Quiet, I said. The usual. We talked for a few minutes about ordinary things. The weather. A new restaurant opening downtown. Then Daniel said something that made me pause. Emily's been tired lately, he said. She says work has been crazy. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I asked a simple question. Have you been busy too? Not really, he said. But Emily has had a lot of late meetings. Late meetings. Late coffees with friends. And now, a pregnancy he didn't know about. The pieces were starting to arrange themselves into a picture I didn't like at all. After we hung up, I sat in my thinking chair again. The sun was setting outside the kitchen window. Soft orange light across the table. And that's when another memory surfaced. A small one. Just a few weeks ago, Emily had been standing in the driveway when I arrived for dinner. She was beside a dark sedan I didn't recognize. When she saw my car, she stepped away from the passenger side quickly. The driver pulled away almost immediately. At the time, I assumed it was a rideshare. But now I wasn't so sure. By the time the sky turned completely dark outside my window, one thing had become clear. Emily had been living two different lives. One that Daniel could see. And another one that only existed in the spaces between. Late meetings. Phone messages. Private whispers. And now a pregnancy that, according to her own words, her husband didn't know about. But there was one question I still couldn't answer. Why tell me? If Emily was hiding something, why involve me at all? Unless. The thought came slowly. Heavy. Unsettling. Maybe Emily wasn't just testing my reaction. Maybe she was warning me. Or worse. Maybe she was preparing me. Because if Lily was right, and Emily really had been seeing someone else, then the baby she whispered about at dinner might not belong to my son at all. And if that was true, then sooner or later, the truth was going to destroy my family. For the next few days, I didn't mention Emily's whisper to anyone. Not to Daniel. Not even to Lily. At my age, you learn that reacting too quickly can make a situation worse. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is wait. Wait and watch. Because the truth has a strange way of revealing itself if you give it enough time. And in this case, time was exactly what I needed. The following Sunday morning, Daniel called again. Mom, do you want to come by for dinner tonight? He asked. His voice sounded cheerful, the same way it always did when he invited me over. Emily's making her roast chicken again. I smiled even though he couldn't see me. That roast chicken had become one of Emily's specialties. At least, that's what Daniel always said. I'd love to, I told him. And it wasn't a lie. Because by then, I had already decided something. If Emily was playing some kind of game, I needed to see the board. Their house looked exactly the same when I arrived that evening. The small maple tree in the front yard swayed gently in the wind. The porch light was already on. From inside the house, I could hear Lily's music drifting down the hallway. Normal sounds. Normal life. The kind of peaceful scene that hides problems very well. Emily opened the door before I even knocked. Margaret, she said with her usual calm smile. Right on time. Her tone was warm. Friendly. Almost too friendly. I stepped inside and handed her the small container I brought. Apple crumble, I said. Daniel's favorite. She glanced at it briefly. Perfect, she replied. Then she turned and walked toward the kitchen. No hesitation. No awkwardness. No sign that she had whispered something life-changing to me just a few days earlier. If I didn't know better, I might have thought that moment never happened. Dinner that night felt almost identical to the previous one. Daniel talked about work. Lily complained about a history assignment. Emily asked me about my garden. It was all very polite. Very ordinary. But the longer I sat there, the more something about the atmosphere felt rehearsed. Like everyone was performing a role they had practiced many times before. Except me. I was the only one who didn't have a script. Halfway through dinner, Daniel mentioned something that caught my attention. Emily's been exhausted lately, he said, reaching for his glass. She's been falling asleep on the couch before 10. Emily laughed softly. Well, work has been crazy. She said it quickly. Almost automatically. I watched her carefully. Her expression didn't change. Her voice stayed light. But there was a small detail most people might not have noticed. She didn't look at Daniel when she said it. She looked at me. Just for a second. And in that second, I felt the same strange sensation I had felt during the whisper. Like I was being measured. After dinner, Daniel stepped outside again to check something in the backyard. Lily disappeared down the hallway toward her room. Once again, Emily and I were alone in the kitchen. The sound of running water filled the room as she rinsed the plates. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I decided it was time to ask a very simple question. Emily, I said calmly. She turned slightly, still holding a dish in her hands. Yes? I met her eyes. When are you planning to tell Daniel? She didn't pretend not to understand. She knew exactly what I meant. For a brief moment, the kitchen became completely still. The water kept running in the sink. But Emily didn't move. Then she set the plate down carefully. Turned off the faucet. And dried her hands with a towel. Only after that did she answer. Soon, she said. The same word she had used before. Soon. Not tomorrow. Not tonight. Just, soon. I studied her face carefully. Most people would feel nervous in a conversation like that. Guilty. Defensive. Emily looked none of those things. She looked calm. Almost confident. Like someone who already knew how the story would end. Daniel is going to be very happy, she added lightly. The sentence sounded normal. But something about the way she said it felt strange. Because happiness didn't seem to be her main concern. Timing was. Daniel came back inside a moment later. Did I miss dessert? He asked. Emily smiled immediately. Of course not, she said. I was just about to serve it. The moment disappeared again. Just like before. Emily cut the apple crumble. Daniel joked about eating too much sugar. Lily wandered back into the kitchen asking if there was ice cream. The evening continued exactly the way a normal family dinner should. But by the time I drove home that night, one thing had become very clear to me. Emily wasn't afraid of being discovered. If anything, she seemed perfectly comfortable waiting. And people only wait like that when they believe the outcome is already in their favor. Which meant whatever Emily had planned. It was bigger than a secret pregnancy. And sooner or later, that plan was going to involve my son. Whether he was ready for it or not. The strange thing about suspicion is that once it appears, it changes how you see everything. The same house. The same people. The same conversations. Nothing looks quite the same anymore. After that second dinner at Daniel's house, I began noticing things I might have ignored before. Little pauses in conversation. Quick glances at phones. Moments that didn't quite fit the picture everyone else seemed comfortable believing. And slowly, those moments started forming a pattern. 3 days later, Lily called me again. It was late afternoon. I had just come back from watering the plants in the backyard when my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Grandma, she said quietly when I answered. Her voice had that same careful tone it had the last time she called. Yes, sweetheart. There was a short pause. Then she said something that made me sit down immediately. I saw him again. For a moment. I didn't respond. Because I knew exactly who she meant. The man? I asked gently. Yes. Where? At the grocery store parking lot. My fingers tightened slightly around the phone. Was your mother with him? Another pause. Yes. Lily began describing what she had seen. She had been riding home with a friend from school. As their car passed the grocery store near the highway, she spotted Emily standing beside a dark gray sedan. The same type of car I had seen weeks earlier in Daniel's driveway. This time, Lily said she watched carefully. Her mother wasn't just talking to the driver. They were standing close. Very close. Close enough that it didn't look like a casual conversation between acquaintances. Did they see you? I asked. No, Lily said. We drove past too fast. Did you recognize him? No, but he looked younger than Dad. That detail sat heavily in the air between us. Younger. After we hung up, I remained at the kitchen table for a long time. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the window, casting long shadows across the floor. Everything in the house looked peaceful. Normal. But the more information I gathered, the clearer the situation became. Emily wasn't just hiding something. She was maintaining two separate lives. One inside Daniel's home. And another one outside it. Late meetings. Phone messages. Private encounters in parking lots. And now, a pregnancy announcement she hadn't shared with her own husband. The pieces were no longer scattered. They were starting to fit together. That evening, Daniel called again. Mom, he said, Emily told me you might come by this weekend. His voice sounded the same as always. Trusting. Unaware. Yes, I replied calmly. I thought I might stop by Sunday afternoon. Perfect, he said. We're thinking about repainting the living room, and Emily wanted your opinion. I almost smiled at that. Emily asking for my opinion about the living room. After everything that had happened, the idea seemed almost ironic. But I agreed anyway. Because the more I thought about the situation, the more certain I became of one thing. If I wanted the truth, I needed to see things for myself. Sunday afternoon arrived with clear skies and a soft breeze. When I pulled into Daniel's driveway, something immediately caught my attention. A car I didn't recognize was parked down the street. A dark gray sedan. The same color Lily had described. For a moment, I sat in my car watching it. The engine wasn't running. No one seemed to be inside. After a few seconds, I shook my head. Maybe it belonged to a neighbor. Maybe I was letting my imagination get ahead of me. Still, the uneasy feeling stayed with me as I walked toward the front door. Emily greeted me with her usual polite smile. Margaret, she said. Come in. The house smelled faintly of fresh paint. Daniel appeared from the living room holding a brush. Mom, he said, what do you think of this color? The wall behind him was a pale shade of blue. Very nice, I said honestly. Calm. Emily stood beside him, arms crossed lightly. Yes, she said. That's exactly the feeling we wanted. Calm. The word echoed strangely in my mind. Because the life Emily was presenting inside that house looked calm. Orderly. Peaceful. But outside those walls, a very different story seemed to be unfolding. Later that afternoon, Daniel stepped outside to rinse the paintbrushes. Lily was upstairs working on homework. And once again, Emily and I found ourselves alone. It was becoming a familiar pattern. Just the two of us. A quiet kitchen. And something unspoken hanging in the air. Emily leaned against the counter, studying me with that same curious expression. You've been very calm about everything, she said suddenly. Her words caught me slightly off guard. About what? I asked. She smiled faintly. You know exactly what. The baby. The secret. The whisper. All of it. I met her gaze steadily. At my age, I said quietly, you learn that patience usually reveals the truth. Emily's smile widened just a little. almost approving. Maybe, she said. Then she tilted her head slightly. But sometimes the truth arrives faster than people expect. Her words stayed with me the entire drive home that evening. Because something about the way she said them felt less like a warning. And more like a countdown. As if Emily already knew exactly when everything would change. And somehow, I had the growing feeling that whatever was coming next was going to happen very soon. There's a moment in every family story when things quietly cross a line. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just one small moment where everything shifts from suspicion into something much harder to ignore. For me, that moment came on a Wednesday afternoon. And it started with a phone call from Daniel. I was in the middle of trimming the roses in my backyard when my phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. "Hi Mom," he said when I answered. His voice sounded a little different than usual. Not upset. Just thoughtful. "Hi sweetheart," I said. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," he replied quickly. "Actually, I wanted to ask you something." I sat down on the small wooden bench beside the garden. "Of course." There was a short pause. Then Daniel said something that made my chest tighten. "Emily told me something interesting today." For a moment, I didn't respond. Because there were only two possibilities. Either Emily had finally told him about the pregnancy. Or she had told him something else entirely. "What did she say?" I asked calmly. Daniel laughed softly. "Well, apparently she told you something at dinner last week." There it was. So Emily had decided the time had come. But the question was, what exactly had she told him? "What do you mean?" I asked carefully. Daniel sounded amused. "She said she told you were thinking about having another baby." The words landed gently. But they didn't match the memory I had. Because that wasn't what Emily whispered. "Not exactly." "She said you seemed a little surprised," Daniel continued. "Well," I said slowly, "it would be wonderful news." Daniel chuckled. "Yeah, that's what I thought too." Then his tone shifted slightly. "Although Emily said she wasn't sure if she wanted another kid yet." That sentence sat quietly between us. Because it revealed something important. Emily hadn't told Daniel about a pregnancy. She had only planted the idea of one. Just enough information to prepare the ground. But not the truth. Not yet. After we hung up, I remained sitting in the garden for a long time. The roses smelled sweet in the warm afternoon air. A soft breeze moved through the leaves. Everything looked calm. Peaceful. But inside my mind, the picture was becoming clearer. Emily had told me she was pregnant. She had told Daniel they were thinking about another child. Two different stories. Two different audiences. Which meant the pregnancy wasn't simply a secret. It was a strategy. 2 days later, Lily came over after school. She does that sometimes. Daniel and Emily both work late, and my house is closer to her bus stop. She dropped her backpack by the door and headed straight for the kitchen. "Grandma, do we have snacks?" she asked. "Always," I said with a smile. I handed her a plate of apple slices and peanut butter. She sat at the table and began eating while scrolling through something on her phone. For a few minutes we talked about normal things. Her history project. A science quiz. But eventually she set her phone down and looked at me. "Grandma?" "Yes?" She hesitated. Then she said quietly, "Mom's been texting that guy a lot." I didn't react immediately. "What guy?" I asked gently. "You know," she said. "The one I told you about." She picked up her phone again. "I've seen his name pop up a few times." "What name?" I asked. Lily frowned slightly. "I don't remember exactly." Then she added something that made my stomach drop. But Mom changed his name in her phone. I looked at her carefully. What do you mean? Lily shrugged. It used to be a guy's name. Now it just says Sarah. Teenagers notice more than adults realize. Especially when they live in the middle of the situation. And you're sure it's the same person? I asked. Lily nodded. Yeah. Because Mom never texts anyone named Sarah. She said it so matter-of-factly. Like she was describing something obvious. And suddenly another piece of the puzzle slid into place. Emily wasn't just meeting someone secretly. She was covering her tracks. Changing names. Creating explanations. Building a story. That evening, after Lily went home, I sat once again in my thinking chair. The house was quiet. The sun had already set. And I kept thinking about something Emily said to me just a few days earlier. Sometimes the truth arrives faster than people expect. At the time, I thought she might be warning me. Now I wasn't so sure. Because Emily seemed far too calm. Too confident. Like someone who already knew exactly how everything was going to unfold. Which left only one real possibility. Emily wasn't afraid of the truth. She was controlling when it would appear. And that meant whatever she had planned. The final move hadn't happened yet. But it was getting closer. And when it finally did, it wasn't just going to change her life. It was going to change my son's life too. By the time that week ended, I had begun to realize something about Emily. She didn't rush. Everything she did seemed carefully timed. Every word. Every conversation. Even the secrets. They didn't appear suddenly. They appeared exactly when she wanted them to. And that thought stayed with me the following Friday evening. Because that was the night something unexpected happened. Daniel called around 7. Mom, he said, sounding slightly distracted, have you heard from Emily today? I immediately sat up straighter in my chair. No, I replied calmly. Why? Well, he said slowly, she said she was going to meet a friend after work, but she's not answering her phone. The same explanation again. Meeting a friend. Coffee. Work. It was becoming a familiar pattern. Maybe her phone died, I suggested gently. Yeah, Daniel said. That's probably it. But his voice carried just a little uncertainty. The kind people feel when something has happened more than once. About an hour later, Lily texted me. A simple message. Grandma, are you home? I replied immediately. Yes. 10 minutes later, I heard a knock at my front door. When I opened it, Lily was standing on the porch. Her backpack hung from one shoulder, and she looked slightly out of breath. Hey sweetheart, I said. What's going on? She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. Dad's still waiting for Mom, she said quietly. Her phone goes straight to voicemail. I nodded slowly. And you came here? She shrugged. I didn't want to sit there listening to Dad worry. That answer made my chest tighten a little. Because Lily shouldn't have to manage situations like that. Not at 16. I made her some hot chocolate and we sat at the kitchen table. For a while, neither of us said anything. Lily stared down at the mug in her hands. Finally she spoke. I think she's with him again. Her voice was soft. But certain. The man you saw? I asked. She nodded. I've seen his car before. What kind of car? A gray one, she said. Kind of sporty looking. A dark gray sedan. The same one I had seen near Daniel's driveway. The same one Lily saw at the grocery store. The same one that had been parked down the street last Sunday. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Around 9 o'clock, Daniel finally called again. His voice sounded tired this time. Emily just got home, he said. I glanced across the table at Lily. She's okay? I asked. Yeah, he said. She said her meeting ran late and her phone battery died. The explanation was simple. Convenient. But I noticed something else. Daniel didn't sound fully convinced. Sometimes trust doesn't disappear all at once. It fades slowly. Like a light dimming in a room. After I hung up, Lily looked at me. She always says that, she murmured. What do you mean? Her phone dying. Lily leaned forward slightly. But the thing is, she hesitated. Then she said something that made my heart sink. I saw her texting in the car last night. Silence filled the kitchen. You're sure? I asked. Yes. So the phone wasn't dead. No, teenagers don't always understand the weight of the things they notice. But adults do. And in that moment, the situation became clearer than ever. Emily wasn't just hiding something. She was lying. And not just to Daniel. To everyone. Lily stayed with me for another hour before Daniel came to pick her up. When he knocked on the door, he looked tired. The kind of tired that comes from worry. Thanks for letting her hang out here, he said. Anytime, I replied. Emily wasn't with him. She's resting, Daniel explained. Long day. I nodded politely. But inside, I felt something else. A quiet certainty growing stronger. After they left, I stood by the front window for a while. Watching Daniel's car disappear down the street. The neighborhood was peaceful. Streetlights glowing softly. Crickets chirping somewhere in the distance. Everything looked exactly the way a calm suburban evening should. But beneath that calm surface, something much more complicated was unfolding. Emily was juggling secrets. Meetings. Messages. A hidden relationship. And somewhere in the middle of all that, a pregnancy she still hadn't told Daniel about. But one thought kept returning to me again and again. Emily hadn't seemed nervous. Not once. Not during the whisper. Not during our conversations. Not even when she knew Lily might notice something. She seemed almost prepared. Like someone who had already planned every step ahead of time. Which meant the moment she finally revealed the truth wouldn't be accidental. It would be deliberate. Carefully timed. And when that moment arrived, my son would be the one standing in the middle of it. There's a moment in every situation like this when suspicion stops being quiet. Not because someone confesses, but because reality begins to slip through the cracks. For me, that moment came about a week after Lily showed up at my door that Friday night. And it happened on a Monday morning. I was in the kitchen making coffee when my phone rang. Daniel. His name flashed across the screen earlier than usual. 8:12 a.m. Hi Mom, he said when I answered. But something in his voice had changed. It was tight. Careful. Like someone trying not to jump to conclusions. Morning, sweetheart, I replied. What's going on? There was a pause. Then Daniel said something I hadn't expected. Emily told me something last night. My hand stopped halfway to the coffee cup. Oh. Yeah, he said slowly. She says she might be pregnant. For a moment, I said nothing. Because technically, that wasn't new information. Emily had already whispered that to me weeks ago. But hearing Daniel say it out loud made everything feel different. More real. What did you say? I asked gently. Daniel laughed softly. But it wasn't the happy laugh I expected. Well, I was surprised. I mean, we hadn't exactly planned it. Another pause. Then he added something else. And she says she only just realized. Only just realized. The sentence lingered in my mind. Because that wasn't what she told me. Not even close. After we hung up, I sat down in my thinking chair again. The morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen window. Birds chirped outside. Everything felt calm. But inside my head, the pieces of the story were shifting again. Emily had finally told Daniel about the pregnancy. But the timing was interesting. Very interesting. Because she had told me weeks earlier. And now, suddenly, she was telling him. Which meant something had changed. Something had pushed her to move to the next step of whatever plan she was building. Later that afternoon, Lily called again. This time she sounded frustrated. "Grandma," she said, "Dad told me Mom might be pregnant." "Yes," I said softly. "How did you know?" She sighed. "Because they were arguing." That made my chest tighten slightly. "Arguing?" "Yeah." "What about?" Lily hesitated. Then she lowered her voice. "Dad asked when she found out." "And?" "She said just a few days ago." I closed my eyes for a moment. Because that was the third version of the same story. First version, whispered to me. Second version, we're thinking about another baby. Third version, I just found out, each one carefully adjusted. Each one slightly different. Like someone editing a script. "Grandma?" Lily said. "I'm here." I think Dad doesn't believe her. Her words were simple. But they carried weight. Because Lily knew her father. Children always do. "What makes you think that?" I asked. "He kept asking questions," she said. "Like what?" "Like how far along she might be." "And?" "Mom said it was too early to know." Lily paused again. Then she added quietly, "But Dad said she looked pregnant already." The kitchen suddenly felt colder. Because if Daniel had noticed something didn't match the timeline, then the questions were already starting. That evening, I received another call from Daniel. This time his voice sounded tired. "Mom," he said. "Can I ask you something honestly?" "Of course." There was a long pause. Then he asked the question I had been expecting for weeks. "Did Emily say anything to you before yesterday?" The room fell completely silent. Because this was the moment I had been waiting for. Not the moment to accuse. Not the moment to guess. Just the moment when Daniel started asking his own questions. "What do you mean?" I asked carefully. He hesitated. Then he said something that confirmed everything I suspected. "She seemed nervous when I told her I might ask you." I leaned back slowly in my chair. That explained a lot. Emily hadn't whispered that secret to me randomly. She had wanted to see how I would react. Because she knew this moment might come. "I think you should talk to your wife," I said gently. Daniel exhaled slowly. "Yeah," he murmured. "I guess I should." There was something else in his voice now. Not anger. Not yet. But doubt. And doubt can be dangerous. Because once it appears, it rarely disappears on its own. After we hung up, I sat quietly in my kitchen. The house was completely still. But for the first time since that dinner whisper weeks ago, something had changed. The secret wasn't mine anymore. Daniel had begun to see the cracks himself. Emily's careful timing. Her shifting explanations. Her sudden announcement. The story she was trying to control was starting to move beyond her control. And once the truth begins moving like that, it doesn't stop easily. Which meant one thing. The confrontation I had been expecting for weeks was finally getting closer. And when it happened, it wouldn't just reveal the truth about the pregnancy. It would reveal everything Emily had been trying so carefully to hide. When doubt enters a marriage, it rarely stays quiet. At first it whispers. Then it starts asking questions. And sooner or later, those questions demand answers. For Daniel, that moment arrived a few days after our phone call. And I knew it had happened the moment he showed up at my house unannounced. It was a Thursday evening. I had just finished washing the dishes when I heard a knock at the front door. When I opened it, Daniel was standing on the porch. He wasn't smiling. That alone told me something had changed. "Hey Mom," he said quietly. "Hi sweetheart." I stepped aside so he could come in. Daniel walked into the living room slowly, like someone carrying a heavy thought. "Everything okay?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he sat down in the chair across from mine. The same chair Robert used to sit in when he visited. Finally Daniel spoke. "I think something's wrong." Those 4 words hung in the room for a moment. "What makes you say that?" I asked gently. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. It was a habit he had when he was nervous. "I asked Emily more questions about the pregnancy," he said. "And?" "She got defensive." That wasn't surprising. But the next part was. "She couldn't answer some basic things," he continued. "Like what doctor she called. Or when exactly she found out. Or why she waited to tell me." Each sentence came slower than the one before. Like Daniel was hearing his own doubts for the first time. "I'm sure there's an explanation," I said carefully. Daniel shook his head. "That's what I thought too." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "But something doesn't feel right." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel said something that told me exactly how serious the situation had become. I checked the timeline. That sentence changed the entire conversation. "What timeline?" I asked. Daniel looked up at me. "The timeline for pregnancy." His voice sounded strange saying the words. Almost embarrassed. I started counting backward. He took a slow breath. "And according to Emily, the timing doesn't make sense." The room became very quiet. Because once someone begins counting backward, the truth often isn't far behind. "She says she found out a few days ago," Daniel continued. "But the doctor appointment she mentioned, that clinic only does blood tests after 8 weeks. I watched him carefully. "You called the clinic?" I asked. "No," he said. "But I checked their website." Daniel let out a short, humorless laugh. "I never thought I'd be researching pregnancy timelines on the internet." He leaned back in his chair. "Mom, something's off." The way he said it told me he wasn't just confused anymore. He was worried. And worry leads people to look more closely at things they once trusted completely. "Have you asked Emily directly?" I said. Daniel nodded. "Last night." "And?" "She said I was overthinking it." That answer sounded familiar. Too familiar. Because it's the kind of answer people give when they don't want the conversation to continue. Daniel stared down at his hands. "She also said something else." "What?" She asked why I suddenly seemed suspicious. The word suspicious lingered in the air. Because suspicion had been quietly growing for weeks now. Not just in Daniel. In Lily. In me. But Emily was the only one pretending everything was still normal. "Mom," Daniel said slowly. "I need to ask you something honestly." I nodded. "Okay." He looked up at me. "Did Emily tell you anything before she told me?" The question had finally arrived. The one Emily must have been hoping to avoid. For a moment, I studied my son's face. He looked tired. Confused. But most of all, he looked like a man who was preparing himself for an answer he might not like. "I think," I said carefully, "that you should talk to Emily again." Daniel watched me for a moment. long enough to understand what I wasn't saying. Then he exhaled slowly. So she did say something. I didn't confirm it. But I didn't deny it either. And sometimes silence answers more clearly than words. Daniel stood up after a while. I guess I have a lot to think about, he said. I walked him to the door. Outside, the streetlights had already turned on. The neighborhood looked quiet and peaceful. But Daniel didn't look peaceful anymore. Mom, he said before leaving. Yes? If something is wrong, he stopped halfway through the sentence. Then finished it anyway. I want to know the truth. After he drove away, I stood by the front window for a long time. Because Daniel had reached the point Emily had been trying to delay. He was no longer accepting the story as it was given. He was examining it. Testing it. And once someone begins doing that, the story rarely survives unchanged. Which meant the moment Emily had been preparing for all along was approaching. The moment when explanations would stop working. And the truth, whatever it was, would finally have to stand on its own. By the time the next Sunday arrived, I could feel the tension building. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quietly, the way pressure builds under the surface before something finally breaks. Daniel had been asking questions. Lily had been noticing things. And Emily had been adjusting her story again and again. 3 different versions already. Maybe pregnant. Thinking about a baby. Just found out. When stories keep changing like that, it usually means one thing. The truth is trying to get out. Daniel invited me to dinner again that Sunday. His message was short. Mom, can you come over tonight? No mention of roast chicken. No cheerful jokes. Just a time. 6 o'clock. That alone told me the evening wasn't going to be a normal family dinner. When I arrived, the house felt different. Quieter. The television wasn't on. No music from Lily's room. Just the faint sound of voices coming from the kitchen. Low. Serious. Daniel opened the door before I could knock. He looked tired. The kind of tired that comes from not sleeping well. Hey Mom, he said. Hi sweetheart. He stepped aside and let me in. Emily stood at the kitchen counter. Her posture was straight. Composed. Almost formal. Lily sat at the table, staring down at her phone without actually looking at it. No one said anything for a moment. Then Daniel cleared his throat. I thought it might be good if we all talked tonight. There it was. The conversation that had been approaching for weeks. Dinner was simple. Take-out containers from a nearby restaurant. No carefully cooked meal. No casual conversation. Just food placed on plates while everyone avoided eye contact. Daniel waited until we were all seated before speaking. Emily told me again that she's pregnant. His voice was steady. But the tension in the room tightened immediately. Emily nodded calmly. Yes. Then Daniel added something else. But we're having trouble agreeing on the timeline. The word timeline hung in the air. Because everyone at that table knew exactly what it meant. Emily folded her hands together. You're overthinking this, she said quietly. Daniel shook his head. I'm not overthinking. He leaned forward slightly. I'm asking simple questions. When did you find out? Emily didn't answer immediately. Then she said the same sentence Lily had already told me. A few days ago. Daniel nodded slowly. And before that? What do you mean? You told my mom something different. The room went completely still. Emily turned toward me. Her eyes met mine again. The same calm look she had during that first whisper. But this time there was something else behind it. Calculation. I didn't say anything different, she replied evenly. Daniel glanced at me. Mom? I didn't rush to answer. At my age, you learn that timing matters. And this moment didn't belong to me. It belonged to Daniel. Emily did speak to me at dinner, I said carefully. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. And? Emily interrupted before I could continue. I told Margaret we were thinking about having another baby. Her voice sounded smooth. Prepared. Like a line she had practiced. Daniel looked back at her. That's not what Mom said. Emily tilted her head slightly. What did she say? Daniel didn't respond immediately. Instead he looked at me again. Mom, what exactly did Emily tell you? For a moment, the entire kitchen held its breath. Lily slowly lowered her phone onto the table. Daniel waited. Emily watched me. And I realized something important. Emily wasn't afraid. She wasn't panicking. She was watching. Just like the first night. Waiting to see which direction the conversation would go. She said she was pregnant, I answered calmly. Emily's expression didn't change. But Daniel's did. You said that weeks ago, he asked. I nodded slightly. Emily leaned back in her chair. That's not exactly what I meant, she said smoothly. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? I meant I thought I might be. Daniel's voice grew sharper. That's not what Mom just said. Emily shrugged lightly. Maybe she misunderstood. The word misunderstood landed like a stone in the room. Because that's often the final defense when explanations begin to fail. Daniel stood up suddenly. His chair scraped softly against the floor. Emily, he said slowly. I've been asking simple questions all week. And every answer keeps changing. Emily remained seated. Still calm. Still controlled. Daniel, you're making this more dramatic than it needs to be. He stared at her. No, his voice was quieter now. But firmer. I think I'm finally starting to understand exactly how serious it is. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Lily whispered something so softly I almost missed it. Dad, Daniel looked down at his daughter. What is it? Lily hesitated. Then she said the sentence that pushed the entire conversation over the edge. I've seen Mom with another guy. The silence that followed felt enormous. Because that was the moment the secret stopped being contained. The moment everything Emily had been controlling for weeks suddenly began slipping out of her hands. Daniel slowly turned his head toward Emily. And for the first time since this whole story began, Emily didn't immediately have an answer. For a moment after Lily spoke, no one moved. The kitchen felt completely frozen. For people sitting around a table that had hosted hundreds of ordinary family dinners, suddenly holding a truth none of us could pretend not to hear. Daniel slowly turned toward Emily. You want to explain that? He asked. His voice wasn't loud. But it carried something new in it. Not confusion. Not doubt. Certainty. Emily remained seated for a few seconds. Her hands rested calmly on the table. The same calm she had shown from the beginning. The same calm she had shown the night she whispered that sentence to me across the dinner table. But this time the room was different. Because this time, she no longer controlled the story. Lily doesn't understand what she saw, Emily said finally. Lily shook her head immediately. I know what I saw, she said quietly. Daniel looked between them. Emily. His voice was firmer now. Who is he? Emily didn't answer right away. Instead, she exhaled slowly. And for the first time since this whole situation began, the confidence in her expression began to fade. I met someone. A few months ago, she said. No one spoke. Not even Lily. Because sometimes the truth doesn't need explanation. Just hearing it said out loud is enough. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. A few months ago, he repeated. Emily nodded. Yes. And the baby? That question hung in the air. Heavy. Unavoidable. Emily looked down at the table. Then she said something very quietly. I don't know. The words hit the room like a sudden drop in temperature. Daniel stared at her. You don't know? Emily shook her head slowly. It could be yours. The silence that followed was enormous. Because that single sentence carried every fear Daniel had been slowly discovering for weeks. And now it was no longer a suspicion. It was reality. Daniel stood there for a long time without speaking. I could see the weight of it settling on him. Not just the betrayal, but the realization that the life he thought he was living had been quietly changing behind his back. Finally he spoke again. When were you planning to tell me? Emily hesitated. Then she gave the answer that explained everything. When I was sure. Daniel gave a short, hollow laugh. So you told my mother first? Emily glanced toward me. Her voice softened slightly. I needed to see how she would react. That sentence confirmed what I had suspected from the very beginning. The whisper. The secret. The test. Emily hadn't been sharing news that night. She had been measuring the room. Preparing the ground. Daniel ran a hand across his face. Then he turned toward Lily. Sweetheart, he said gently, why don't you go upstairs for a bit? Lily looked uncertain. But she nodded. As she walked past me, she squeezed my shoulder briefly. A small gesture. But one that said more than words. Then she disappeared down the hallway. Leaving the three of us alone. Daniel sat back down slowly. The room felt strangely quiet now. Almost peaceful. But it was the kind of peace that comes after a storm finally breaks. I think we both know what happens next, he said. Emily didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply nodded. Because some truths are too large to push back into silence. I left shortly after that. Not because I didn't care. But because this was no longer my conversation. It belonged to Daniel. And to whatever decisions he needed to make about the life in front of him. When I stepped outside, the night air felt cool against my face. The neighborhood was quiet. Streetlights glowing softly. The same calm suburban street where I had parked countless times before. But something had changed. Not the house. Not the street. Just the illusion that everything inside that house had been as simple as it seemed. A few weeks later, Daniel came to see me again. This time he looked tired. But calmer. Emily moved out, he said. I nodded slowly. And the baby? He took a long breath. The doctor says we'll know for sure after it's born. The uncertainty was still there. But something else had returned to his voice. Clarity. Before he left that evening, Daniel stood by the door for a moment. Mom, he said. Yes? Thank you. For what? For not lying to me when I finally asked. I smiled softly. At the end of the day, I told him, family deserves the truth. Daniel nodded. Then he stepped outside and walked to his car. That night, as I sat once again in my thinking chair by the kitchen window, I thought about that first dinner. The whisper. The quiet test. The moment Emily leaned close and said those words only I could hear. At the time, I thought she was sharing a secret. Now I understand what it really was. The beginning of a story that was already unraveling. And sometimes the most important thing you can do in moments like that is exactly what I did that night. Stay calm. Listen carefully. And wait. Because the truth always arrives eventually. Even if it takes a little time to speak for itself.